So, welcome everybody. I'm really happy to welcome you all at the University of Potsdam. This is actually the 6th workshop in the series that we plan within the Twisted Transfers project, and it's the first one that, because of COVID, takes place actually here at the University of Potsdam of the 3 that we have planned. So for some of you, even if you have been working in the project for basically almost 2 years now, more than 2 years actually, almost 3, it's the first time that you are here at the University of Potsdam. So very welcome at our university and at the campus at am Neuen Palais. As you already know, we have a tradition within our workshops, which is having an external guest. External not only because he is not from Potsdam, nor from the partner universities in the UK, earlier Roehampton, now Durham, but also because our guests are always coming from disciplines which are not the core disciplines of the project, so no classics, no ancient history. And our guest today is a social anthropologist, and I'm sure that we'll learn a lot from him about how corruption works and how we can work with concepts and methods about research on corruption. So let me introduce very quickly our speaker, and then we can directly switch to listening to his keynote lecture. I'm really very happy to have among us today Professor Andrew Sanchez, who is, as I already said, a professor of social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Andrew studied at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he obtained his PhD in 2009, and then he was further working and teaching at LSE until 2012. Then he started an international career that brought him first to Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, then back to the UK, first at the University of Kent, and then since 2016 at the University of Cambridge. International is not only the fact that he was 2 years in Halle, but the fact that his research has been basically taking him through the world, and in India, for instance, where he did a lot of ethnographic research, and I think we will hear about that also in his lecture tonight, but also to Norway, for instance, as we learned earlier when we were chatting before this lecture. So, among his publications, I want to mention particularly the monograph "Criminal Capital: Violence, Corruption and Class in Industrial India," which was published in 2016, which is, of course, extremely relevant to the topics of our research project, but also a very long list of articles and book chapters, most of them really extremely important for us in the Twisted Transfers project. I would like to mention here The Novelty of the Gift, a British anthropologist and the Trends of Ethnography, which was published in History and Anthropology in 2017, and Morse and the Gift, a chapter which has appeared this year in 2022 in the 3rd edition of the Handbook of Economic Anthropology. So, dear Andrew, thank you very much that you accepted our invitation to Potsdam. We're really very glad to have you here tonight, and we're really looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. So I was first approached about this project in Potsdam and Roehampton in 2018. And, when you guys approached me, I instantly said yes. I'm really delighted to come and, make some contribution to this project. And that's been sitting there in my email kind of folder marked Potsdam Roehampton Corruption Project for years now. And I've been really looking forward to it. And what I've been looking forward to is the fact that usually I always deal with an audience of social scientists, which means that we're all playing with the same deck of cards and we're all kind of shooting at the same goals, right? Which is kind of satisfying, but it's really interesting kind of working with people who have completely different conceptions of what they're doing. And today's discussions have been absolutely fascinating for me, and I've really enjoyed it. So today's lecture is going to summarise my anthropological research on corruption. Now, my guess is that all of you will be completely unfamiliar with that work, and I'm also guessing that you'll be unfamiliar with the style of the discipline in which I work. So I'm going to start with a brief preamble to frame the research. Right? So since 2006, I've conducted ethnographic field research in a place called Jamshedpur, which is the industrial company town of the Tata Corporation in eastern India. And I've used that work to try and interrogate the systemic relationship between criminality and modern capitalism, and to consider how people would use languages of corruption to try and articulate their experience of class. Now, in that project, I've questioned the assumption that capitalism is only incidentally related to both political corruption and violence. Now, to put that in context, in the city of Jamshedpur, the Tata Corporation has employed a very sizable amount of the local population since the 1900s, and it's provided them with housing, healthcare, education, and utilities. However, since the liberalisation of the Indian economy in the early 1990s, all of those features of urban life have been eroded. And how they've been eroded is that permanent Tata company jobs have been replaced by casual ones. Now, that's the local expression of a global process by which people in most sectors of the global economy are being progressively alienated from job security. And as academics, you presumably have experienced that too. Now, my work in Jamshedpur has looked at criminality in trade unions, in corporations and the state, and it's asked what the effect of those processes are on industrial employment security. And from there, I've explored how those processes would be understood and critiqued by industrial workers themselves. So my research in Jamshedpur uses 3 areas of ethnography to develop a critical political perspective on the relationship between capital and institutional criminality. So first, ethnography on the shop floor of the Tata Motors automobile plant explores how the global casualisation of labour is experienced by communities of people that formerly enjoyed formal sector employment security. Secondly, I do research among trade unions and worker activists to consider how the degradation of labour is related to the corruption and the failure of collective action. Finally, ethnography among a variety of entrepreneurs and professional criminals considers the broader relationship between capital, violence, and corruption. Now, the conceptual contribution of that project has been to try to redefine the meaning and the function of corruption in a way that questions its distinction from both organised crime and capitalism. So what I show is that rather than being an aberrant process that is peripheral to the economy and which would work through the actions of deviant individuals, corruption is rather integral to economic processes, and it functions through systemic interactions between political, corporate, and criminal actors that seem to have very distinct skills and distinct forms of authority. So while an episodic understanding of corruption would stress the social and political distinctions between those actors, a systemic modelling rather focuses on the interactions between violent criminals, political representatives, and in this instance, corporations. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the lecture has 2 parts. The first part explores the relationship between corruption and dispossession. The second part explores the idea of corruption. And that second part asks how corruption relates to wider forms of elite criminality that extend beyond things like bribery. And both parts of the lecture are going to be illustrated with extended examples from my field research in Jamshedpur. And I've put those examples in there because I think as a kind of a non-disciplinary audience, they just make it easier for you to understand what's going on. Okay? So part 1, corruption and dispossession. One evening in the summer of 2006, I sat in the back of an auto rickshaw with a smartly dressed industrial manager named Ashok, who claimed that the iconic Indian corporation that he worked for was run by murderers. Ashok's hometown of Jamshedpur in eastern India is the site of the Tata steel plant, which was built in 1907 by the industrialist Jamshed Tata after whom the city is named. Today, the Tata Corporation also has major global interests in telecommunications and in the manufacture of automobiles. As a successful Indian-owned enterprise founded during the colonial era, both the Tata Company and the city that it administers occupies an important place in the Indian national consciousness. Tata is popularly renowned for its high levels of corporate social responsibility, and Jamshedpur is a prosperous industrial city of 1.3 million people, many of whom are descendants of the labour migrants that arrived there during the first half of the 20th century. However, the erosion of permanent employment since the 1990s has prompted a radical reconfiguration of the relationship between the corporation and its town, and is the subject of a popular local discourse about elite criminality. In this lecture, I discuss why workers in one of India's oldest industrial firms believe that the decline of their employment security is facilitated by cooperative criminality in trade unions, corporations, and the state. Drawing on research conducted among managers and the casualised workforce of Jamshedpur's Tata Motors plant, I argue that urban industrial workers use languages of corruption to speak critically about the processes by which power is distributed in India. By situating popular corruption discourses against the operation of labour politics and enterprise, I describe how practices of corruption and criminality consolidate class power. I also talk through the reliance of modern corporations on those things. So I first met Ashok at the reception desk of the Tata Motors plant while attempting to schedule a meeting with the plant's corporate communications department. As he passed by me on the way to his office, Ashok stopped to talk. He was a likeable, soft-spoken man in his mid-40s, who spoke impeccable English with the clipped tones of the Indian upper-middle class. After listening to a loose summary of my project for a few moments, he offered to take me on a tour of his workplace, after which he would introduce me to his more senior colleagues. Now, a few weeks later, with a fresh Tata Motors gate pass hanging around my neck, Ashok and I made the 8-kilometre journey from his home in a suburban company township to my apartment in the city centre. I'd spent that evening talking with his wife and young son, and Ashok now insisted that he accompanied me home in case I was cheated or misplaced by a rogue rickshaw driver. Climbing into the back of the rickshaw, Ashok and I watched the model steel town go by as we drove towards my home. The Tata vision in the early 20th century imagined a cohesive company town of the North American model, where settled workers would live in company homes, be cared for by company hospitals, and their children educated at company schools. Throughout the 1900s, Tata laid miles of wide, straight roads, along which they planted trees for the benefit of future generations. The roads led to townships that housed tens of thousands of steel workers in bungalows and apartments. Parks, sports clubs, and colleges followed, and the town grew as the company diversified into the manufacture of an array of metal products and heavy goods vehicles. As we puttered through the night in the back of our rickshaw, Ashok and I passed the neighbourhoods that were named for their respective Tata industries. The neighbourhood of Telco, still known by the old name for Tata Motors, Tube Colony, Cable Town, Tin Plate, and Agrico, which is the district where the company produces agricultural tools. In each of these neighbourhoods, we passed the same small square workers' houses, the plain apartment blocks and villas of senior management, occupied by the descendants of migrants from across India. Peppered between the industrial townships were eclectic non-company neighbourhoods that were built on land leased from the Tata Company. Here, in various states of poverty and prosperity, lived hundreds of thousands of merchants, entrepreneurs, service sector workers and labourers, Jamshedpur's old guard of professionals and business people chose to dwell in grandly decaying houses and smart apartment complexes in the centre of town, while their children gradually retreated from the crowded city centre to go and live in the sterility of suburban gated communities. As we drew closer to my apartment in one of the city's oldest neighbourhoods, the air became thicker with the smell of rust, concrete and exhaust fumes. We were approaching the Tata Steelworks, which occupied 7 square kilometres in the very centre of the city. More than 30,000 people worked behind the plant gates, and the siren that signified breaks and shift changes could be heard echoing over the lanes of nearby neighbourhoods day and night. It was here that the Indian steel industry was born. It was here where the company town model first came to South Asia. And it was here where a corporation owned by Indian people famously flourished at the very height of British colonialism. The Tata Iron and Steel Company at Jamshedpur supplied cheap steel for the building of India's railways, and it largely relied on British trade for many decades. However, the city of Jamshedpur, with its cosmopolitan workforce residing in comfortable modern homes, was a utopian vision in the struggle for Indian independence in the years leading up to 1947. Today, the city still occupies an iconic place in the Indian national imagination, and Tata is popularly regarded as a company of flawless pedigree. Like most company managers, Ashok was in awe of the personal example of company founder and national hero Jamshed Tata, the Parsi industrialist who in the late 19th century anticipated the vast mineral wealth that lay below the soil of eastern India, and who famously built Mumbai's opulent Taj Mahal hotel after he was refused entry to one of that city's whites-only establishments. When he died in 1904, Jamshed Tata left behind him the makings of Jamshedpur and an industry that really prefigured the ambitions of the post-colonial state. Ashok was very proud of this ancestry, and he enjoyed discussions of company history, during which he was an animated and eager source of information. However, Ashok's demeanour would change quite noticeably if he was pressed on more current local matters. When asked about wage levels in his workplace, for example, or when asked about union politics in the city's industries, his characteristic enthusiasm and good humour began to wane. If our conversation strayed into those areas, he spoke quietly and hesitantly, and he made vague allusions to things that he did not care to elaborate on. He was also strangely reticent to talk about his own career. Whereas his colleagues typically entered into long, relaxed discussions about their childhood, their schooling, their work history and ambitions within hours of our meeting, the finer details of Ashok's employment history remained a mystery to me for some weeks. I knew only that he had been an executive in Tata Steel for 20 years, before transferring to one of the smaller Tata Industries 2 years earlier to take up an almost identical position. That evening, in the back seat of an auto rickshaw, weaving between trucks and motorcycles while our driver constantly blared his horn, Ashok chose to tell me why he had changed jobs. Ashok asked if I knew of the man called V.G. Gopal, president of the Tata Workers' Union, the TWU. Gopal, he said, had been assassinated in 1993. I was aware of Gopal's murder, and I knew that he'd been shot outside the union's building in Jamshedpur while getting out of his car. I told Ashok that I'd visited the building several weeks earlier, where I found a bronze bust of Gopal garlanded with marigolds at the entrance. On that day, a polite administrator took me on a tour of the building's lecture theatres and library. As we passed through the silent, spotlessly clean building, my guide directed my attention to shelves of management textbooks, monographs of labour relations, and framed portraits of union luminaries. With some discomfort, he told me that the bust outside commemorated a union leader who was, quote, killed by gangsters. Meters from the memorial, the macabre monument of Vijay Gopal's car sat slowly rusting in the parking lot where he'd left it. Ashok nodded his affirmation. It was true, he said, that Gopal had been shot by gangsters. However, he went on to claim that Gopal's assassination had been orchestrated by corrupt officials in the Tata Workers' Union, who collaborated with the company to implement an unpopular program of redundancies in the Tata Steel plant. Ashok described how the company homes, schools and hospitals that characterised Jamshedpur were a costly expenditure that could not be sustained in a competitive global market. Throughout much of the 20th century, Indian taxes on imports were high, foreign investment tightly controlled, and foreign ownership of Indian companies all but prohibited. The older national corporations flourished in that environment, and the company town model provided Tata with a stable labour force. However, when India's economy was liberalised from 1991 onwards, Tata's monopolies in the production of trucks and private sector steel began to collapse in a matter of months. Cheap imports flooded the domestic market, and Tata's rivals were reinvigorated by investment from Japan, Europe, and North America. Faced with declining profits, Tata proposed early retirement for large numbers of employees in Jamshedpur, whose jobs could then be filled by cheaper casual workers. This new flexible labour force would earn lower wages and would have none of the employment benefits that characterised Tata work for several decades. Families that had worked in the same plant and lived in the same townships for generations now faced a new future where children would enjoy a lower standard of living than their parents. Ashok described how when Tata redundancies were first proposed in the early 1990s, much of the Tata Workers' Union's leadership prided themselves on a harmonious relationship with the company, which had not seen its members go on strike since the 1920s. To maintain that harmony, the union had refused membership to thousands of disgruntled maintenance persons and seasonal labourers, and had been beset by allegations of corruption for decades. When the union's president, Vijay Gopal, proposed a general strike to resist the new casualisation of permanent jobs in 1993, it was therefore not altogether unexpected that he met the strongest opposition from within his own trade union. While our driver bullied his way through the traffic, Ashok leant towards me to whisper that Gopal's assassination had been orchestrated by the senior management of Tata Steel and the union's inner circle, who, he said, had conspired with one another to facilitate the company's redundancy scheme. Ashok suggested that Tata favoured corrupt trade unionists with gifts of cars and housing in the city's best neighbourhoods, and that the union was permitted to run what he called a profitable mafia in the allocation of increasingly scarce workers' housing quarters. He claimed that evening to have left Tata Steel to extricate himself from the criminality of its management, and he warned me, somewhat dramatically, that I should be careful researching such matters. Ashok's allegations may seem extraordinary, but they are at least partly based on fact. Vijay Gopal's assassination was orchestrated by a Tata Workers' Union official named Amrinder Kumar Singh, who was convicted of his murder in 2006. Kumar Singh's prosecutors alleged that he was a key member of a corrupt group at the heart of the Tata Workers' Union, which coerced its opponents with the aid of contacts in organised crime. Following Gopal's death, the casualisation of Tata labour met no further resistance from the union, and it was highly successful in reducing the company's liabilities towards its workforce. By the time I began research on the shop floor of the Tata Motors plant in 2006, more than 3/4 of all workers were employed on fixed-term contracts. These employees could be terminated with no notice. They were barred from membership of the plant's only trade union, took home as little as 1/5 of the wages of their colleagues, and were not entitled to sick pay, pensions, company healthcare, homes, or company schooling for their children. These ostensibly casual workers were recruited directly from traditional company families, and they typically accumulated years of continuous service on a single shop floor as they were shifted back and forth between different job titles. By the time our auto rickshaw pulled up outside my home, Ashok's story had finished. He'd spoken for no more than 15 minutes, but his words lingered in my mind for a very long time. I was intrigued by his suggestion of a systemic relationship between capitalism, corruption, and violence, and I wondered how widely such an idea might be subscribed to in Jamshedpur. As I came to know the city's people better, I discovered that Ashok was not alone. I stood on the shop floors of factories, sat in the offices of business people, drank tea with school teachers and socialised with debt collectors and a variety of criminal entrepreneurs, and I heard variations on the following 3 key ideas repeated constantly in the popular discourses of local people. First, that life was harder for Tata workers now than it had been in the past. Second, that since the 1990s, elites and corporations have seized a larger share of India's wealth to the detriment of those on the bottom of the pile. And third, that process was facilitated by the use of corruption and violence. What my informants in industry suspected, and my informants in business readily confirmed, was that criminality consolidated the broad class positions of modern Indian society. Following E.P. Thompson, one might consider that the social phenomenon of class is fundamentally an historical struggle for political economic power, which entails competing discursive ways of explaining how that process works. Since the concept of class struggle is so strongly associated with the discourses of the labour movement, it's not surprising that the topic has thus far received the greatest ethnographic attention in studies of trade unions. However, a fuller understanding of the dynamic process of class must, I think, move beyond the assumption that class struggle is principally enacted within working class political institutions. On the contrary, in contexts of labour reform and civic crisis, systemic criminality within corporations and unions are acts of elite class struggle in and of themselves. They are forms of struggle that enable the dispossession of workforces from employment security and political representation. The corruption discourses of Jamshedpur's Tata workers suggest deliberate, mutually beneficial relationships between corporate capitalism, collective action, and criminal coercion. These corruption models describe the transformation of employment regimes as the local fulfillment of a wider neoliberal agenda of capital accumulation, enabled through the disempowerment of very large sections of the local labour force. The pervasive assumption of institutional corruption on the Tata shop floor serves to level the class antagonisms of a highly stratified workforce, which means that the responsibility for flexible accumulation is believed to rest with a powerful, corrupted elite, rather than resting with permanent workers themselves. In this respect, corruption discourses constitute an important avenue of shared political consciousness for an increasingly fractured labour force. However, systemic violence within Tata labour politics principally reasserts authority within the company and the union itself, to the detriment of popular political action. Jamshedpur's Tata workers popularly conceive of economic exploitation, corruption and coercion by the corporation that employs them, by local and national politicians, the judiciary, trade unionists, and gangsters. In an environment like that one, radical acts of collective action are exceptional, short-lived, and typically involve very small numbers of participants. As such, while the suggestion of elite criminal enterprise inspires a critical and somewhat cohesive class consciousness, it also constrains alternative forms of collective action through the implicit threat of violence. If the making of class involves the meeting of force through time, then in Jamshedpur, networks of industrial capitalists, corrupt political actors, and criminal entrepreneurs meet their working class antagonists with an equally voracious class struggle of their own, which involves cooperation in the pursuit of political economic power. United by commonly pursued interests and sharing complementary power over the production and distribution of capital, large sections of Jamshedpur's dominant class are drawn from those parts of society that profitably negotiate the use of corruption and violence in the pursuit of power. While Jamshedpur's trade union leaders, industrial capitalists, entrepreneurs, and violent enforcers look like they manifest different types of authority and areas of expertise, a conceptual framework that is historically reflexive and is yet still grounded in control over capital allows us to understand how the class power of social elites could be consolidated through cooperation between apparently dissimilar actors in dynamic contexts. While popular discourses on these processes reference a language of corruption, a broader conceptual framework of criminal enterprise is, I think, required to understand exactly how that political economy functions, which is what we're coming to now. Part 2, the idea of corruption. Corruption is the subject of a great deal of popular attention in India. A small corpus of ethnographic research has explored the prevalence of corruption in the Indian civil service, public institutions, and state-run enterprises, while a slightly larger body of work has tackled criminality and patronage in Indian politics. That field has made valuable advances in the collective understanding of how bribe takers and brokers are able to feed at the frontiers of the state by exploiting the desperation of their constituents. However, while an ethnographic focus on the mechanics of patronage and petty bribery may provide a useful insight into the day-to-day operation of the state, that approach tends to limit the understanding of corruption to specific abuses of power that are grounded in the morality and the charisma of individuals. To understand the role that systemic criminality plays in corporate class struggle, corruption must be properly located within those broader entrepreneurial negotiations that we would call organised crime. By situating locally authoritative personalities at the heart of the corruption concept, studies on bribery and patronage rarely trace the broader criminal networks within which corrupt actors are inserted. Far from operating at the fringes of the state and the economy, in places like Jamshedpur, ostensibly corrupt actors are usually enmeshed within long-term negotiations with an array of specialists in organised crime, industrial capitalism, financial services, labour contracting, development, and the judiciary. Those enterprises are as much coercive as they are self-interested, and they usually rely on the complementary application of violence, threat, and the entropy of political representation. While an episodic understanding of corruption would stress the social and political distinctions between those actors, a systemic modelling rather focuses on the interactions between violent criminals, political representatives, and corporations. Vadim Volkov's study of Russian organised crime suggests a helpful framework for understanding things like this, for understanding how criminality enables the consolidation of capital and infrastructure in dramatically changing economic environments, in ways that would collapse the distinction between corruption, coercion, and capitalism. So while the dismantling of the Soviet economy in the early 1990s was ostensibly inspired by economist Jeffrey Sachs' vision of the entrepreneurial kiosk boom, Vadim Volkov describes how economic liberalization largely served to concentrate Russian wealth into the hands of elites and also stimulated a national increase in organized crime. In the first flourishes of post-socialism, a small section of Russian society amassed immense profits by speculating on the country's deregulated natural resources, energy, transport, and communications infrastructures. However, as Volkov describes it, in the absence of an effective judiciary, the fragile contracts of Russian capitalism were underwritten by criminal organizations that safeguarded their clients' competing interests through the threat of force. Comprising unemployed police, soldiers, state security agents, and, interestingly, lots of athletes from the socialist sports academies, these criminal organizations emerged following the collapse of the Soviet Union and sought out unfettered business partnerships with a very wide variety of state actors, investors, and enforcers. And they really exemplify Anton Bloch's earlier modelling of the Sicilian mafia as, quote, violent entrepreneurs. Volkov's model of criminal enterprise serves to critique the notion that modern organised crime functions principally within structured subcultures governed by principles of honour and retribution. A culturalist analysis of organised crime generally obscures the political economy of those practices by drawing boundaries around different types of practice rather than tracing the lines that flow between them. Organised crime is best understood as a series of ongoing business partnerships that not only transgress national, cultural, and institutional boundaries, but critically, they rather exploit the spaces between those boundaries. Following from this observation, what Volkov's model of acephalous entrepreneurial networking contributes is the injunction to try to trace the functional relationships between very different types of criminal actors, and to really theorise how institutional corruption may relate to practices as varied as coercion, economic reform, labour politics, and the consolidation of new forms of class power. Rather than sporadically diverting capital to the informal peripheries of capitalism and the state, corruption is a systemic series of negotiations between authority, corporations, and violence. Volkov's enforcement partnership model can be productively applied to the field of corruption by exploring how political elites mobilise institutional authority and coercive power in mutually constitutive ways in the pursuit of their shared entrepreneurial goals. However, if the model of a networking criminal entrepreneurship that I propose here is well substantiated, then that probably means that many people must find themselves engaging with criminality on a semi-regular basis, including many local entrepreneurs at all levels of the food chain. If that's true, then that raises really important questions regarding the moral rationalizations that people make for their engagement with illegality. We're going to talk that through now. So the anthropologist Jonathan Parry's analysis of Indian bribery provides a useful framework to try to approach those moral tensions of how people think about corruption and criminality. Building on the conceptual foundations laid in earlier work, Parry considers that since the economy is always embedded within social relations, this means that material transactions must be subject to moral evaluations on the part of their agents. In the Indian context that Parry's talking about, that tendency is further reinforced by the Hindu conception of religious gift-giving. And that conception allows for the idea that material objects can corporeally embody the sin of their donor. The role of the religious specialist is to demand and then receive such a gift. And when they do so, they become, to use Parry's parlance, an eater of sin, which means that the person who accepts your gift absolves you of your moral transgressions. For Parry, the primary means through which most people engage in Indian corruption is through the giving of bribes to petty state functionaries. He argues that these types of everyday corruption are popularly conceptualized through that lens of religious gift-giving, which means that they allow large numbers of bribe givers to transfer the sin of their actions to specialist bribe eaters. This is an important way that ordinary people are able to engage in everyday corruption while still rationalizing the morality of their actions. And I can talk this through in more detail by using a couple of examples to unpack the complexity in moral terms of the things that we would call bribes. So the term bribery is a difficult one. To the untrained eye, bribery seems to describe a simple category of actions that involve paying money to illegally determine the outcomes of bureaucratic processes. However, bribery really describes quite a varied collection of different practices, each of which have their own moral implications. For example, one might voluntarily pay a bribe to avoid the proper consequences of one's actions, such as paying a police officer not to arrest you for a crime that you really did commit. And in my field research, I once witnessed a research participant do just this: pay a bribe to law enforcement to avoid being charged with an assault that they had definitely committed. Now that is a very different type of action to paying a bribe simply to ensure that somebody in a position of public trust continues to perform their work in the way that they are supposed to. Such as the day when I was in my house in India and the local postman knocked on the door and asked for a bonus to ensure that my mail arrived quicker than everybody else's. Now, the implication being that without paying the bonus, the mail wouldn't arrive at all. And that theory proved to be entirely correct when I refused to pay the bribe and I no longer got any letters. Now, clearly, in each of those two cases, there are really different moral processes at play. The first example implies an initial act of wrongdoing on the part of the bribe giver who assaulted somebody, while the second implies an initial act of wrongdoing for the bribe taker, which was my crooked postman. However, in both cases, the very act of handing over the money would make all parties concerned complicit in an act of crime. Now that poses a real dilemma for the moral life of corruption discourses. And it poses a dilemma because I might reasonably have paid that bribe to my postman, kept receiving my letters, and would still feel I had the right to stand here and denounce that practice to you as corruption. If I had done that, I would be in the good company of millions of people. People who are able to somehow be an integral part of the political economy of corruption and would yet believe themselves to be separate and superior from it. And indeed, the most vocal critics of corruption are routinely bribe payers themselves. So, if I asked you now to imagine a situation where you might conceivably pay somebody a bribe, my guess is that many of you probably could imagine doing that under the right circumstances, and a couple of you might even admit it, in the way that I might admit to paying a bribe to get my post delivered, right? But now, if I asked you to imagine yourself taking a bribe, suddenly the proposition seems a bit less morally comfortable. Far fewer people will admit to doing so, because in most cultural contexts, we are more certain that taking rather than giving bribes is wrong. And it's this moral sleight of hand that really explains how people are able to negotiate the tension of denouncing corruption while doing it anyway. That's because it is routinely believed in economies of corruption that the person who takes a bribe is essentially demanding one. When they do so, they are alienating the bribe giver from their moral agency, and to take us back to Jonathan Parry's idea, they are eating their sin. And that's why, although any apparent crisis of endemic corruption must include all of us if it exists, it still never seems to be the fault of the person you're talking to at any given time. And that's because it is always imagined there is a greater institutional actor feeding further up the food chain of the bribe. So, that's one way of theorizing bribes. However, being rooted in the conceptual framework of material exchange, this model of the moral life of the bribe does not provide us with the conceptual tools to understand types of corruption that rely on negotiations that cannot be properly called transactions. So while analytic frameworks premised on an understanding of bribery can help us to understand preferential treatment or the withholding of services, those frameworks nonetheless do not engage with criminal abuses of authority that function primarily through threat and coercion, and include things like extortion and racketeering. And as I'll illustrate, where those practices exist, they are generally integral to the criminalisation of complex bureaucratic institutions. And that leads me, ultimately, to my conclusion that corruption is best theorised as a form of elite organised crime. So the anthropologist Alexei Yurchak draws on long periods of fieldwork in Russia during the 90s and 2000s to think about just this issue. And he describes the tendency for persons in complex institutions to ask themselves how their role within governance can be exploited financially. Yurchak says, the corrupt entrepreneur is not somebody that's deterred by rules, regulations, paperwork, or codes of practice. It's the other way around. It's the ubiquity and the complexity of those things which compels people to work through corrupt persons and to pay bribes to get things done. Or more coercively, the authority of the state can be wielded against you by people that demand bribes in exchange for not harming your interests. So Yurchak says, corrupt persons are like valves within institutions. They're like valves because they demand things in order to keep power and resources flowing through them in a given direction that's in your interest. So here I'm going to offer another example to try and show how that type of entrepreneurialism works and why it's therefore appropriate to theorise corruption in terms of broader institutional criminality. So here's the example. So as part of my long-term interest in Jamshedpur, I've also spent time conducting field research there in a scrap metal yard. So this scrap metal yard was a small workplace where people would buy and sell metal waste. And it was owned by a man called Manoj, and all the names in this presentation are pseudonyms. So one morning, a man in his 30s strolled into Manoj's yard while I was doing field work. This man came in, he greeted him, and he accepted an invitation to sit down and drink tea. This guy was polite and softly spoken, and while he sat there drinking his tea, Manoj handed him a thick bundle of cash. The man counted the money and handed it back. He then asked if he could see the ledger that recorded all the yard's transactions. So he read through the handwritten pages of the book, which detail how much metal has been bought and sold, to whom and for what price. So what's going on? This professional and basically quite pleasant man was a local police officer. One of his jobs was to help a more senior police officer to run an extortion racket among small businesses. And to that end, he came to Manoj's yard every month to collect a percentage of his takings. And being thorough in his work, from time to time he liked to read the ledger, and he liked to also check how much money was on site. And that's what I'd been witnessing that day. So after he completed his investigations, he said thank you, finished his tea, and left. A little while later, the man's boss arrived in the scrapyard. This more senior police officer was a menacing and quite aggressive character. Referring to the figures uncovered by the reading of the ledger, he determined that Manoj was making much more money than he claimed, and he demanded an immediate cash payment for backdated arrears. The monthly extortion payments had gone up, and he left the yard in a flurry of recriminations and threats. So when I collected this data in the 2010s, Manoj's scrapyard was paying 40% of its gross monthly income to an extortion racket run by police officers. And I'm using this example because the content of this racket largely substantiates my other research participants' discourses about systemic elite corruption. And it goes like this. The racket began several years earlier when a local police officer entered the yard and selected a piece of metal waste from the ground, apparently at random, before then demanding proof of its origin. Manoj was unable to prove that this specific piece of metal had been purchased legally, and as a consequence, he was charged with theft. The officer then demanded an ongoing monthly payment to stall those minor charges, with the threat that they could be progressed at any time. A threat like that was not to be taken lightly, because in that city it's common for accused persons to spend several years in pre-trial detention, even for quite minor crimes. As that officer moved up the ranks of the local police force, he went on to become a patron to his junior colleagues. He earned their support by allowing them to go out and demand protection payments of their own from Manoj, and also to other scrap dealers. As this big man system of police corruption incorporated more and more people, naturally the size of Manoj's payments increased too. At the time of fieldwork, Manoj was making monthly payments to dozens of police officers, which he recorded in another black book. Each page of the book is headed with the name of a different local police station, with rows listing the names of officers and columns representing the months of the year. A neat tick is placed in the relevant monthly column when the officer has been paid. and some pages list as many as 20 officers from a single station. Depending on seniority, some leave the yard each month with as little as 30 rupees, which is 35 cents. Others leave with about 70 euros. So for Manoj, corruption is the technology that allows a small class of elites to pursue their interests to the detriment of everybody else's. The senior police officer that oversees the scrapyard racket is an entrepreneurial valve, much as Yurchak suggests. The point here is that it is the presence, not the absence, of laws and formal bureaucratic processes that provides the opportunity for corruption to work. This is why, in this lecture, I theorise corruption as a systemic form of criminality that contains logics of coercion and exploitation and is much broader than the simple bribe of some popular discourses. And as I'll argue, it's helpful to distinguish between languages of corruption that are about relations between individuals and those that are about systems of power. In an influential analysis of provincial North Indian corruption discourse, the anthropologist Akhil Gupta observes that the most visible interface between the state and the citizenry are personal negotiations with provincial bureaucrats, through which one imagines how the state works. Following that premise, the everyday business of politics is exercised in the workplaces, the bazaars, and the tea stalls of Indian towns, as people share commentaries on local processes. Accordingly, the popular corruption discourse which relates to this is, I think, a provincialising. It's provincialising because it suggests that corruption is concentrated at the local level of the petty state and is primarily rooted in the bribery demands of isolated, self-interested individuals. However, since the imagined state of that analysis is premised on discussions of petty bribery, the corruption discourse that emerges would tend to suggest that a core of decency and accountability persists at the higher reaches of Indian politics, which is simply deviated from by the profiteering of local crooks. As such, that's a corruption model about specific abuses of power rather than a model about the operation of power per se. This is what I term an episodic discourse, which is to say that corruption exists as a potentiality which is then concretized in specific encounters with individuals. The core of an episodic discourse is that it discusses processes primarily in reference to the particular actions of deviant persons whose behaviour is considered to be the expression of personal values, tendencies, and interests. By comparison, the popular corruption discourse that I encountered in Jamshedpur is systemic, and it's applicable to the study of a much broader range of phenomena. A systemic model resists the tendency of an episodic approach to draw conceptual and moral boundaries around events and persons. It rather emphasises the relationships between broad networks of actors. So far from seeing corruption as isolated acts of deviance from society's norms, the systemic corruption discourse posits violence, coercion, and bribery to be expressions of the key principles of modern capitalism. Now, this systemic corruption discourse suggests that criminality is an integral feature of the Indian political economy. Importantly, this popular model in Jamshedpur has an empirical foundation as well as a discursive significance. For political authorities in Jamshedpur, the things we call corruption are part of a broader entrepreneurial project focused on the economic opportunities of mercantilism, debt collection and racketeering, the accumulation of coercive resources, and the exercise of legal influence. So to conclude, by the beginning of the 21st century, the employment security of the Tatar labour force had been largely eroded and the organs of industrial labour politics subverted in the interests of capital itself. In this environment, the bulk of Tatar workers assumed that modern Indian political economy was characterised by social elites' use of systemic criminality to consolidate their control over the production, the ownership, and the movement of capital. An analysis of that environment demands a critical rethinking of the relationship between capitalism and systemic criminality. So corporate capitalists, political representatives, institutional entrepreneurs, and good old-fashioned crooks look like they have different skills and different working environments. However, what this lecture has argued is that these apparently distinct agents are engaged in deliberate, mutually beneficial negotiations that fulfill broadly shared class interests. I suggest that the entrepreneurial relations of corruption and criminality not only create classes of actors that benefit from one another's transgressions, they also create a class of people dispossessed by those processes, and a class of people that articulate a political consciousness through systemic corruption discourses themselves. One of the lecture's aims is to try and demonstrate that the broad range of practices that we call corruption are not sporadic, isolated events that are only incidental to the political economy. On the contrary, incidences of corruption may express systemic negotiations that enable the consolidation of power. Furthermore, the model I have advanced suggests that while concerns over petty bribery occupy the greater part of many popular corruption models, the study of corruption should be expanded for a fuller consideration of violence, coercion, and enterprise. So although this argument is grounded in a very specific ethnographic case study, I describe a broader tendency in modern capitalism. Namely, that if class is a dynamic struggle for control over capital, then dominant classes cooperate in this struggle through the exchange of skills and resources that might sometimes include criminality. This insight demands a conceptual modelling of corruption that explains how complex institutions are inculcated within the negotiations of organised crime, and doing so requires a systemic rather than episodic perspective. That's it.